Hi everybody, welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. My guest today is Dr. Oliver Scott Curry. He is a senior researcher at the Institute of Cognitive and Evolutionary Anthropology at the University of Oxford. In addition to his research, which focuses a lot on morality, Dr. Curry has previously taught courses on evolution and human behavior, covering evolutionary theory, animal behavior, evolutionary psychology, cross-cultural psychology, statistics, and research methods. He is also a consultant for kindness.org. Dr. Curry, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Okay, so I guess that today we're going to focus a lot on morality, the evolution of morality, how morality works in humans and human societies. So I guess that the first question I would put forth is, what in the evolutionary history of Homo sapiens led to the evolution of cooperation at such a level that is really difficult to find in other species, even in other primate species, and that probably only falls short of highly social insects like bees and ants and so on?
Well, yeah, that's a good place to start. So one thing to keep in mind is obviously cooperation is much more ancient than humans or primates or
Sure.
or even multicellular organisms. So we're talking about the origins of cooperation go right back to the origins of life. Mm-hmm. By the time you get to our closer to our branch of the tree of life, we're one of many social primates. Humans have lived in social groups for about 50 million years, or human ancestors have, and it looks like in the last let's say million or so years, or 500,000 years or so, cooperation has just become the humans' USP. That's what they've specialized in. It looks like one of the selection processes for that is increased reliance on collaborative hunting, and also intergroup competition, both of which have increased the value, increased the rewards of cooperating, and have selected for us to value cooperation even more, and have equipped us with a range of psychological mechanisms that enable us to cooperate as never before. It just seems that's the way that we've specialized.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and particularly in evolutionary psychology and coming from game theory as well, people talk a lot about evolutionarily stable strategies. So what is the importance of game theory in trying to understand how human cooperation developed over our evolutionary history?
So I think there's two huge contributions that game theory makes. So one is so game theory is the mathematical description of social interactions. Mm-hmm. And one of the things it can do is first of all, it can distinguish between competitive and cooperative interactions. Competitive interactions being win-lose, so one party wins at the expense of another, and non-zero sum interactions, which are win-win situations. They're problems or interactions where if you get it right, both parties benefit from the interaction. So that's one sort of fundamental thing game theory can do for you. Another thing it can do is distinguish between different types of non-zero sum or cooperative interactions. So everyone's heard of prisoners' dilemmas and social dilemmas and public goods games, and the solutions to those games like reciprocity. But there are other kinds of non-zero sum games like coordination problems and hawk-dove games, which select for other types of cooperation, other types of cooperative strategies. So the first thing game theory does is give you a good grip on the problems, on the various different problems of cooperation that humans and other animals face. And secondly, it can help you identify the solutions to those problems. And in order for it to be a stable solution, it has to be one that solves the problem, but also and does so in a way that it means that that particular solution, that particular strategy, that way of behaving, it can persist, is stable, it can defend itself against predation or being undermined or being defected against. So it's one thing to sort of seize the prize of cooperation. It's another thing to do so in a way that's sustainable and persists. So game theory can do all of that for you.
Mm-hmm. And do all humans, do the entire humanity share the same moral apparatus, the same moral evolved apparatus? I'm asking this because I already had conversations with evolutionary psychologists and also people that come mostly from cultural evolution, like Robert Boyd. And one of the arguments he makes mostly is that culture would have been more important than genetics in our evolutionary history, because during the Pleistocene, as he argues, the climate changed a lot and in different places. And so people were put under different selective pressures in different places and also over time. And so I would like to ask you, what is your opinion or what the data tells us that you know about this specific topic? About specifically morality, the data shows that we really do share some aspects of morality that they are innate to all of us, or because of these aspects of climate fluctuation during the Pleistocene, we were really put under different selective pressures in different places, and culture has a bigger role to play, perhaps.
Okay, so there's two separate questions there. One is whether morals are universal, and secondly, whether if they are universal, is this because of genetics or culture?
Yeah, sure.
So on the first question, it does look like some of these cooperative traits are sort of form the backbone of morality all around the world. My colleagues and I conducted a review of descriptions of ethics, ethnographic descriptions of ethics in 60 cultures around the world. Mm-hmm. And we were looking to see whether some of the classic some of the classic types of cooperation recognized by evolutionary game theory, whether these were considered moral all over the world. And we found that they were. So we were looking for 7 candidate universal moral rules. Was it considered morally good to, I haven't got enough fingers, to look after your family, to be loyal to your group, to return favors, to be brave, to defer to your superiors, to share disputed resources evenly, and to respect property? So these are all well-established types of cooperation in the literature, and we found that these types of behavior were always considered morally good. It was always considered good to do these. They're very widespread, so we found them all around the world, and we found no counterexamples, no cultures in which any of these 7 types of cooperation were considered morally bad. So the main argument of that paper is that morality is all about cooperation, and cooperation can explain that explains what morality is and what people place a moral value on. So those do seem to be more or less universal. The question is, well, what explains that? Is it because of common genes, or because people face common problems, that social life has this prisoner's dilemmas or coordination problems crop up everywhere? And I think my view is it's inevitably going to be a bit of both. And I think one useful distinction might be between ends and means. So whereas my best guess is that whereas people our moral goals, our moral values, our moral ends are more or less the same all around the world. People everywhere have the same value, the same thing. There's a lot with some variation. There's a lot more variation in the means that we use to achieve them, and that's where culture comes in. So in some places, the way that we compete for status is through throwing huge feasts. In other places, it's through other conspicuous displays of generosity. In other places, it's online giving to online charities. in more modern technological societies, we've invented a whole range of what Steve Pinker calls technologies of trust, like ticket barriers and tax collectors to enforce. These are new institutions and technologies to scaffold reciprocal exchanges on a huge scale, and obviously they vary a lot more. So yeah, I think it's going to be a bit of both. Some common evolved biological themes, more variation on culture, the cultural means of achieving those ends. That's what I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and another follow-up question that I would have for you about this specific topic is that don't you agree that even when we talk about culture and try to separate it as an entity that influences human behavior apart from genetics, that it is not really possible to talk about culture as some pure thing that is out there, but that culture is also the result of our evolved psychological systems working around, and I mean, we couldn't have anything cultural that couldn't be at least processed by our brain, right?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, we wouldn't. Anything we do is dependent on our evolved biology and psychology in that sense. I think the point is how much of the content of culture is well, I was going to say predetermined, but I don't mean that. I think the way I look at it is that humans are an inventive species. They can invent new ways of doing things, and crucially, they can invent ways that natural selection never dreamt of or didn't anticipate. So we can do genuinely novel things. Obviously, we're not inventing those things completely at random, and nor are they catching on completely at random. They tend to catch on primarily if they satisfy our goals, if they achieve what we want, if they keep us well fed and healthy and happy. So in that sense, culture is sort of obviously anchored by what people want, but within that, there's lots of scope for sort of more arbitrary cultural variation.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, and I would like to ask you about a very specific topic that is related to human morality and cooperation and conflict. That is, what was the importance of the development of killing tools to even out the disparities in terms of physical force, particularly among men, in our evolutionary history?
Well, I haven't done any direct research on that, but my understanding is the standard view is that by giving even the weakest member of the group the power to kill others, and including the more dominant members, that leveled out the hierarchies a bit. So whereas other closely related social primates have quite steep social hierarchies, humans, according to that view, have leveled out a bit more. I think another consequence of deadly weapons is, as I mentioned before, increasing the dangers posed by other groups, other coalitions, and therefore raising the value of cooperating within your coalition for the purposes of mutual defense. Mm-hmm. So if it, I don't know for sure, but it seems like it made people sort of more equal and more bound together.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Okay, and when you do studies on human cooperation and try to see what was the role of the environment and the environmental pressures that led to the evolution of certain types of morality, do you include human sociality in the environmental side of things, or is it part of innate aspects of humanity? I don't know.
So what?
I mean, do you treat the social aspect as also part of the environment, as another environmental pressure, or
Yeah.
is it more psychological, more innate, in terms of the development of cooperation and when
Uh,
study? Yeah,
well, I mean, other people are a potent selection pressure,
yeah.
and the argument is that we've been competing and cooperating with other people for millions of years, hundreds of thousands, millions of years, and inevitably those interactions have selected for different traits in humans. I mean, and that's in a sense that's the whole point of game theory, to be able to model those dynamics and understand and make some predictions about what's likely to happen.
Right. Okay, so about a very specific paper that you wrote, that is, you studied how basically altruism works in networks, and you came to the conclusion that individuals tend to be more altruistic to friends of friends in a network, and they are more altruistic toward better connected members of the society. Could you talk a little bit about this and what is the importance of understanding these dynamics in studying human cooperation?
Yes. So you caught me a bit off guard here because I didn't know what you were going to ask me, and I think that paper is, when was that from? It's like 5 years ago.
I don't have the
But
year.
well, from recollection, so I think the point of that paper was it was looking at whether friends are more altruistic to friends who have friends in common. Was it that one? And
Yes.
the idea there was, if the basic idea was, if you why do people cooperate? Why do people cooperate with their friends? It's partly to do with reciprocity. I help you and you help me in the future. And why? Another reason why, or a related reason why you would cooperate, is because by doing someone a good turn, you might enhance your reputation as a good guy, as someone who's trustworthy, who's worth cooperating with. And conversely, if you were to defect, to cheat someone else, then that might damage your reputation amongst your friends and other potential cooperators. So the idea there was, other things being equal, a friend of yours, you'd be less likely to cheat a friend of yours who knew all your other friends than you would be to cheat a friend who didn't know any of your other friends. Because in that second case, you're, as it were, the opportunities for your the gossip about your bad behavior or somewhat contained. So that was a little online experiment to see, where we asked people to name their friends, to say which of their friends knew their other friends, and then to ask them how cooperative they would be to them in some online games. And lo and behold, people were more cooperative to friends that knew their other friends. I think it was the more friends your friends knew, the more cooperative you were to them, irrespective of how much you liked them individually.
Exactly.
Is that right? I can't remember.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's interesting that you touched a little bit on gossip, because I also wanted to ask you about what is the role of gossip in human societies in promoting cooperation and altruism. Does it have to do with, or is it related to reputation formation or something like that?
Yeah, so I haven't worked on this directly, but yeah, it amplifies the effects of your behavior in a social context. So if it's one thing to cheat one person and have to put up with or deal with their retaliation, but if what you've done becomes public knowledge, and if that information spreads, then you're harming you're not just worried about the immediate cost of doing that, but you're worried about the wider damage to your reputation. So it increases the benefits of being good and increases the costs of being bad.
Exactly. And when we study human cooperation and morality in general, do you separate sociality from morality, do you treat them as two different entities, or isn't it even possible to do so?
Um, well, yeah, I don't really think they're two separate things. So uh, often people talk about pro-sociality and cooperation, and then say, what's the relationship between cooperation or the various mechanisms for cooperation and morality, as if morality is this other thing. And I don't think that's the case. I don't think there's anything magical or mysterious about morality. I don't think there's some special source. I think moral is just moral is just an adjective. It's just the adjective we apply to cooperative behavior.
Exactly. And okay, and what is talking a little bit more specifically now about kin selection? That is another type of cooperation, right? What is the relationship between the life history of a species, and in this particular case we're talking about Homo sapiens, of course, the necessity of larger parental investment, because in our case we have a long life history, right? And also for extended periods of time. What is the relationship between these, our long life history, and the development of kin selection?
Well, so I suppose it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation in that, so humans are unusual in having, like you said, an extended period of parental investment in the offspring. Mammals are unusual anyway, and birds to some extent, and then humans are especially unusual in that it goes on for years. I have 2 kids, so I know what that's like. And humans are even more unusual in having a very high degree of paternal investment. So it looks like, so having vulnerable young, useless young that don't do anything for you for all those years is a cost, is a risk. So there must be some upside, and the upside might be that it gives children opportunity to be socialized and learn, have an apprenticeship and learn like I said, learn the amazing things that we've invented, better ways of doing things. In order to make that possible, in order to make that investment, so it looks like there was a large selection pressure for kin altruism, favoring investment in offspring and favoring bringing the males on board to protect and invest the offspring. And that's led to a whole suite of morals to do with special obligations to kin and the duty of care and the duty of parents to their offspring, and some side things like aversion to incest with kin, and a yet to be developed area. I think it's led to a whole branch of sexual morality to do with parents cooperating, teaming up to raise kids rather than trying to go it alone, and agreeing to, forsake all others and exchange exclusive sexual access. So it's to summarize, the benefits of having a kid that can soak up all these cool ways of doing things has selected for kin altruism and those special obligations and a whole suite of sexual morality.
Mm-hmm. And isn't it another very important topic here about the specific question about the fact that our species has a long life history, also alloparenting? Because I mean, it during most of our history it was very important for us to have allo parents, and so that could also have extended the concept of kin to other people, right? That weren't part of the immediate family, like the parents and the grandparents and so on.
Well, so certainly we evolved in much larger kin networks than typically we have now in modern Western societies. So yeah, I think on one study, the average degree of in an average hunter-gatherer society, the average degree of relatedness is just less than being a cousin. So the people that you are surrounded with, let's say, just this is a crude approximation, but let's say half of them were cousins or closer. So just from a sort of straight kin selection, kin altruism point of view, you were surrounded by not just parents, but grandparents and siblings and aunts and uncles and cousins and second cousins and so on. So certainly there was much more opportunity for overlap and joint child rearing. I'm not sure, but I think alloparenting is usually used to refer to sort of non-kin. So your friends and so on, and obviously that was inevitably a part of traditional life too, as it is now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was why I talked about alloparenting, to try to make a link between kin selection and reciprocal altruism, right? Because there could have been people completely outside even the extended family that throughout our evolutionary history were to help with child rearing, right?
Sure, I haven't worked on that directly, but I imagine that's inevitable, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. Okay, and in another of your studies, you discovered how basically kin selection works better in terms of altruistic behavior than reciprocal altruism, directed towards friends independently of emotional closeness. That is, kin selection is much stronger in terms of promoting altruistic behavior than reciprocal altruism, regardless of the emotional closeness of the two people involved. So, what implications does this have for the way we study the basis of human cooperation, if any?
Right. So, I don't know that we said that kin altruism was bigger than reciprocal altruism. All we showed was there's an extra, the two are separate, and when you're dealing with family, there's an extra dollop of kin altruism on top. One of the points of that paper, the kinship premium paper, is that the one you're referring to?
Yes.
So one of the points is to say, so it's easy to think that when you interact with kin, it's all about kin altruism, and when you interact with, for example, friends, it's all about reciprocal altruism. The point of that paper was to say, well, you can engage in reciprocal altruism with your family as well. I mean, if you lend your brother £1,000 and then he pays it back, or if you buy a car from your mum and pay her for it, they're obviously not mutually exclusive categories. But what we expected to find was when you're interacting with kin, when you're cooperating with kin or reciprocating with kin, there would be a kinship premium. There would be a bonus related to the fact that you were related. There's a genetic relationship as well. So when you're dealing with friends, in the simplest case, it's just reciprocity. When you're dealing with family, it's reciprocity and kin altruism. And what that study showed was that seemed to be the case, that people were more, I forget the measure, but people were more cooperative or more generous to their family than they were to their friends. And this was over and above how much you liked them. So it wasn't that necessarily people liked their family more than their friends. It's almost that they, irrespective of whether they liked them, they still felt an obligation to be kinder to them. So, or to put it in a slightly more negative way, you will feel like you have to do things to your family even if you don't like them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now I understand it better. Okay, isn't it difficult to separate, when studying human morality, cooperation from conflict? Because I mean, even in situations when there's conflict, like for example, when people punish other people for deviant behavior and cheaters, and also in intertribal conflict, people are still cooperating with other people in some sort of way, right? So
Yeah, but they are. So, but why is it difficult to? You just done quite a good job of separating them. So that, I mean, that social life is it's a whole sort of mercurial mosaic of different fleeting, or more or less fleeting, more or less stable interactions, and there's lots of opportunities for. Well, there's lots of opportunities for cooperation and competition and conflict. I would make this. This sounds like a pedantic point, but I'd make a slight distinction between competition and conflict, only in the following way: that it's useful to distinguish between like zero-sum interactions, sort of pure competitive interactions, and conflicts, which and those situations where, even though they look like conflicts, there's an opportunity for a mutually beneficial resolution, or there's a way of resolving the conflicts that reduces the cost to both parties, and that's where a lot of cooperation comes from, and lots of our morality comes from. But it tends to get overlooked in traditional accounts that stick with just kin altruism and reciprocity. So the first paper to be John Maynard Smith's first paper on evolutionary game theory was on the hawk-dove games. Hawk-dove games are non-zero sum. The worst outcome is when the two parties go all out for a fight. Two parties are in conflict over some resource, and they can either they can fight or they can withdraw. The worst outcome is they both go head to head and both crack their skulls. It's better if you, instead of having a fight, you can signal your ability to win the fight, and for the person that would be the loser to withdraw. In that way, the outcome is the same. The stronger party still wins the fight, but both parties benefit by avoiding the cost of conflict. And we seem to have a range of those strategies in terms of showing off our abilities, what are called virtues in moral philosophy, deferring to the stronger party, respecting other people's power. In cases where you can divide the disputed resource, you can divide it, so that's where fairness comes from, or you can you can acknowledge and defer to prior possession. That's where property rights come from. So there's a situation that looks like a straight up fight, but there are options available to reduce the costs to the participants, from which everyone benefits. So there's a win-win outcome nested within that conflict, and lots of our moral intuitions come from that interaction.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so in another paper of yours, you talk about what you call a periodic table of ethics. And you include things like kinship, mutualism, exchange, and then 3 specific types of conflict resolution, that is contests, division, and possession. So why did you feel the need to study this specifically and to oppose it to other accounts of perhaps human moral foundations?
Okay, that's a big question. So, why did I feel? What was the first? Why did I feel compelled to study it?
Yes.
Okay. Well,
I'm asking just because there were already other proposals to explain human moral foundations, like Alan Fiske's relational models, for example, and Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations, right? So.
Okay. So the origins of all this is I'm just interested in morality. I'm interested in what it is and how it works and what it's for and where it comes from, and the whole deal. Once upon a time, you could only study that in philosophy, and that's broadly what I did, although it was in the politics department. And I fairly soon became dissatisfied with arguing about ancient Greek theories of human nature and medieval accounts of psychology to try and make sense of how, whether human nature is good or bad, or how people think, or how they make decisions. Especially when, almost literally on the other side of the wall, when I was studying, there were people working on the evolution of cooperation in game theory, on reciprocal altruism, on primate politics, on evolutionary psychology, and all the rest. So I thought, if you want to understand, what humans do, including why they're sometimes nice and sometimes nasty, we should be using the latest and best accounts of psychology, not medieval accounts. So that was sort of my original way into it, and my master's thesis and PhD were on evolutionary accounts of morality. And what I found was, most accounts that took a similar line, that it was useful to look at the evolution of morality, tended to focus exclusively on, somewhat arbitrarily, on a small number of non-zero-sum games, most of all focusing on prisoners' dilemmas and social and reciprocity. And I suppose what I found was, if you just pull at that string, if you pull at that thread, and you go into literature and you look at game theory more generally, you find, prisoners' dilemma is not the only game, and reciprocity is not the only solution. If you broaden your perspective to look at other non-zero-sum games, like I said, like coordination games and hawk-dove games, suddenly you have a much broader palette. You have a much broader range of theories to explain a broader range of moral phenomena. So rather than trying to make everything a solution to a prisoner's dilemma, and make everything some bolt on to reciprocity, you don't need to do that. You can study why people value solidarity with their groups, why they adopt local conventions, why they display virtues like bravery and generosity, why they respect property, why they are in favour of fairness. There's independent explanations of those that are quite often, in practice, often overlap with reciprocity, but are quite independent phenomena. And even if there was no such thing as prisoners' dilemmas, and there was no such thing as reciprocity, you would still have a whole suite of other moral dispositions. You'd still have special obligations to your kin, group solidarity, bravery, deference, fairness, and property rights. So that's where we got to. So that's what I was interested in. If you absorb the cooperation literature in general, you see there's a huge range of untapped theories of cooperation that have been relatively neglected compared to the sort of headline ones. And that's the sort of core of my work at the moment. And I've labelled that approach, morality, as cooperation. So just trying to demystify morality, to say, look, morality is just the name we give to cooperation, or cooperation explains all these moral things. Now, when it comes to alternative, sort of similar accounts to that, you mentioned Alan Fiske's Relational Models and Jonathan Haidt's Moral Foundations. They're broadly on the same page. I mean, they both argue that morality is a product of our, to some extent is a product of has evolved, and they both argue that morality has evolved to promote cooperation. But for reasons that I find somewhat baffling, they miss out. They have a fairly sort of ad hoc collection of types of cooperation, and they miss out some very obvious examples. So to take Moral Foundations, Jonathan Haidt's Moral Foundations, for instance, there's no foundation dedicated to kin altruism. Why is there no foundation dedicated to reciprocal altruism? In the MFT, reciprocity is conflated with fairness, which in game theory are two different things. And there's no, in the Moral Foundations questionnaire, there's no items about reciprocity, about returning favors. So why isn't there a dedicated reciprocal altruism foundation? Why isn't there a costly signaling foundation to do with these hawkish signals of bravery and prowess? Another major explanation of cooperation and altruism in the literature doesn't appear in Moral Foundations theory. Why is there not a domain dedicated to property and property rights? That's been in the literature for 40 years. So So I'm interested in morality. Cooperation seems to explain it. If you look at the full suite of cooperation theories that are available, you have this lovely what I've referred to as a periodic table of ethics, because you have all these discrete theories explaining discrete aspects of morality. And if you do that, you have a broader and richer explanatory account that reflects the literature better than some of these previous attempts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, don't you think that perhaps one thing that lacks in Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations, or perhaps the reason why he was led by the data to propose those 5-6 types of moral foundations, because he also includes liberty for the libertarians basically, is that he was too much focused on politics. And I mean, it's very difficult to talk about this, because politics is also related to the way people socialize with each other and also to morality, right? But perhaps he was too focused on political aspects as cultural manifestations, even though he gives a sense of innateness to these foundations. I don't know if you want to comment something on that.
Well, I don't know. I can't. I don't know inside his mind. I don't know exactly what he was trying to do. I could only see some of the things he said. So certainly he said that the original motivation for moral foundation was to distinguish between liberals and conservatives, or more specifically, argue that liberals didn't have a monopoly on morality, and there were some things that conservatives considered moral that liberals didn't value as much. So that was the original goal of moral foundations, and it to some extent it certainly worked to it achieved that goal to begin with, to distinguish, well, here's some things that liberals value more than conservatives, and vice versa. So and like you say, when he subsequently said, well, I wonder what other moral foundations there are, and someone must have said to him, well, hang on, you've got Democrats and Republicans, what about libertarians? So he bolted a libertarian foundation on. I think that kind of gave the game away. And I sometimes think that what he has is a measure of party identification masquerading as a moral psychology measure.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, because I mean, at least for me, I also had the sense that he dealt with human morality in this case like simply a group phenomenon, but in the sense that how people interact with each other, and not really the moral equipment that we all come equipped with innately to deal with whatever we find in our social environment. I don't know if I'm making any sense here or not, but I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is that when it talks about care, harm, fairness, loyalty, authority, sanctity, purity, it seems like these were what people arrived at in terms of moral foundations after the fact that they were already inside the group and following certain rules, and not really that they came innately equipped with a set of moral foundations that weren't really specific to that type of environment that they would work on. I don't know if I'm making any sense or not.
I think to some extent you are. So let me see if I can come at it slightly differently. So I think there's a whole. I think moral foundations theory and Jonathan Haidt's work is has been very useful in reinvigorating the field and bringing some evolutionary approaches in and getting people interested in it and arguing about it. However, I certainly don't think it's the final word on moral psychology, and I imagine Jonathan Haidt would say the same thing. And there's several reasons for that. One is that, like I say, the original decision as to what constitutes a moral foundation were fairly ad hoc. Jonathan Haidt has even said that in one paper called "How Moral Foundations Were Built on Sand" as a response to a criticism. He explicitly says he disavows taking a principled, theory-driven approach to morality, and instead he takes an ad hoc approach. When it comes to which ads he hocked in the original paper, he says that there were 5 things that he read, including Alan Fiske's work and Shalom Schwartz's work on values, and a Franz de Waal book and Reciprocal Altruism by Trivers, and I forget the 5th one. So he read a few. He had a few sources, and he said, "Here's some things that crop up in a number of these." So it was a fairly limited literature review, and like I say, he missed out lots of aspects of the literature that were available at the time in the mid 2000 and noughts, and things that in principle should have been in there if he was doing an evolutionary cooperative account of morality. So there's some gaps in it. I think it was also, like you say, very much geared towards trying to make sense of American politics, and that's limited its interpretability and generalizability. And there's some interesting work. I just come back from the Human Behavior and Evolution Society meeting in Amsterdam, and there was an interesting work there by David Pinsoff, and looking at the gist of which was, you might think, so according to the standard view, for example, conservatives are more groupish and more interested in purity than liberals. But to a large extent, this seems to depend on which groups you're talking about and the purity of what. So if you say, deferent to authority. So if you say, should you defer to the authority of the police, liberals will say no, and conservatives will say yes. If you say, should you defer to the authority of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, you get the opposite responses. If you say, is purity, should we try and live pure lives, liberals will say no, conservatives will say yes. If you say, is the purity of the environment a moral value, liberals will say yes, conservatives will say no. So it doesn't, and there's lots of examples of that, but so it doesn't seem to be so one way you could put it is that it doesn't seem to be the case that liberals and conservatives have completely different foundations, or even that they might not even value the different foundations to different degrees relative to one another. It's just that the questions in the way it's operationalized in the Moral Foundations questionnaire was designed to and succeeds in picking out sort of arbitrary group differences between the two coalitions.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And don't you think that in order for us to, in the future, have a full account of human morality and all of its flavors, that we should also try to link the study of morality to perhaps personality psychology? Because I'm asking this because when I think about these two immediate thoughts that come to my mind are that, for example, that there are particular aspects of personality psychology, and I'm talking specifically about the big 5 now, like, for example, agreeableness and conscientiousness, that really seem directly linked to how people behave toward other people, right?
Yes, ideally everything would sync up at some wonderful point in the future. So yeah, it should all work together. I suppose my sense is that many of the existing personality measures and some of the existing value measures, like Schwartz's value scale, I think it is. There are lots of measures that have a sort of very general purpose, sort of generic niceness factor. So they have Schwartz's value scale has, I think, benevolence and conformity and tradition, I think, and I forget what the other one I was going to say. Or in personality, you have agreeableness and to some extent conscientiousness. So I suppose my hunch is that they're fine, but a higher resolution understanding of our moral intuitions is possible and is available. And so I would expect there to be a relationship between, say, agreeableness and other types of cooperativeness. But I don't think that they're exactly the same thing. Mm-hmm. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, but
well, it might be the other way around. It might be that once we have a better understanding of all the very specific mechanisms that go into cooperation and altruism and the whole assembly of different mechanisms, this will allow us to. We will come to a point where we see agreeableness was just a sort of a loose, was just a kind of an average of all these other things, and now we can speak more specifically about the particular mechanisms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I understand, but I will just try to give a very specific example and then to have your thoughts on it. That is, for example, conscientiousness has two aspects, and one of them is orderliness. And from the literature I've read, it seems that orderliness has a very strong correlation, at least a correlation, I don't know if there's a causal relationship there or not, with disgust. And the literature of disgust shows that it is a very important psychological phenomenon to explain, for example, how people develop conservative behavior, and again, this again links to how people behave to one another, and even perhaps to some very specific moral foundations, or even to some aspects of the periodical table of ethics. I don't know what do you have to say about that.
Sorry, which particular bit? What's the question?
Okay, so I gave the example about the correlation, the strong correlation that seems to exist between orderliness, that is one aspect of personality related to conscientiousness, and the emotion of disgust.
Right.
And then how disgust operates at the social level and the relationship it has perhaps with morality as well.
So there's two things to say about that. So one is that obviously I think the big five or the big six are very useful constructs, but they're not. There's no theory, but there's no theory behind them, or they weren't motivated by any particular theory. They're data driven in the sense that you ask a million people a million questions and you see what comes out. And obviously subsequently they've been validated against other measures, and now there's obviously lots of interesting things in there. But it seems to me as a general rule, if you're, what you're starting with is an aggregation of folk theories of personality, what people think they're like, or what people think others are like, and that obviously has some value, but it might not be the last word. Just like if you were to do something similar with chemistry, and you were to ask people what kinds of things are there in the world, and then factor analyze the responses, you get, there's big things, small things, hot things, hard things, soft things, whatever. You get a whole assembly of things, and they might have a very robust factor structure and predict other things, but that's not the same thing as having a proper underlying theory of what stuff is and what kinds of stuff there is and what kinds of distinctions there are. And that's one of the reasons why that's one of the advantages that an evolutionary approach has to personality and psychology in general, is that rightly or wrongly, it starts with a prior theory and then is testing that theory and perhaps uncovering things that people perhaps weren't aware of or weren't familiar with, or wouldn't have been able to articulate in a more open-ended study design. Mm-hmm. So to go back to your point, inevitably something like the Big Five you know, inevitably it's going to get some things right. It's inevitably going to hit some of the right notes and capture some of the things about human nature, and it's going to include orderliness and disgust and all the other things. The question is, do we have a theory that can do better? That would be my question. And when it comes to, and then more specifically, when it comes to disgust, I think it's very unclear what the role of disgust is with morality. It's, to go back to the moral foundations. So Jonathan Haidt, right from the get-go, said this is an odd corner of morality. It's not like all the others. He said that. So he says that morality is about cooperation and selfishness, and he goes through the four main original foundations, and he says, hang on, there's another foundation of purity, things that we're disgusted by, which don't have to do with social relations, don't have to do with how we treat one another. So right from the get-go, he had something that was anomalous that wasn't part of his theory. Mm-hmm. And so I don't think that disgust is a moral emotion. Certainly isn't primarily a moral emotion. I mean, the underlying problem of disgust is to avoid pathogens, mm-hmm. and avoiding pathogens is not a moral problem. If I'm disgusted by fruit rotting on a tree and I avoid it, there's nothing moral about that. From a cooperative point of view, you might think that, well, disgust only becomes moralized when it has to do with other people and how people treat each other. In the most obvious case, if people don't look after themselves or are sick and are behaving in ways that put others' health at risk, one of the deadliest things you can do, especially in a world before medicine, you would expect that to elicit enormously strong moral sanctions. If you're doing something dangerous that might kill other people, if you're creating a public bad, if you're coughing on public transport without covering your mouth, this is an absolutely horrific and deadly thing to do, or more deadly in the past. So I don't think that. So you can think of like an overlap, like a Venn diagram. Some things are disgusting, some things are to do with disgust, some things are to do with cooperation, and it's only the cooperative bits of disgust that get moralized. So it's a mistake to focus on the disgust. You should be focusing on the cooperation. Does that make sense?
Yes, it seems to me that it does. Okay, so now another question. Are you also in your work interested in trying to understand how we get from these sort of evolved social strategies and also our evolved moral sentiments to moral norms?
Not really. What do you think the difference is?
I think that I would put it this way. So we have these sort of moral sentiments that were evolved during our evolutionary history, of course, and so we come innately or sort of innately equipped with them. And then, people could be behaving toward one another according to subconscious motivations, let's say, and not really expressively create moral norms as we have in modern societies, let's say. And even in more traditional societies, people are able to express, at least through language, what people can do and what they can't, and how people should behave and shouldn't. So I guess that this would be the difference I established between, perhaps it is more of sort of, in a way, behaving according to subconscious motivations and not really explicitly put norms for according to which the society should behave and people who live in that society should behave, and on the other hand, having that explicitly working on the society, let's say, and that was what I would perhaps call moral norms. I don't know if this is a correct assessment of things we should do or not, but
Well, I suppose I'm not entirely. I'm not entirely clear what a norm is, and it's a bit of a fuzzy concept and has lots of different uses. So, in one sense, it's just a behavioural regularity, what people normally do. In another sense, it's more of a sort of a shared expectation of behaviour, what you expect people to do. In other senses, it can be, like I said, a novel, an innovative way of behaving, one that natural selection didn't foresee, and or it can be the solution, a more or less arbitrary solution to a coordination problem, like a convention. Mm-hmm. So I'm interested in how all those different moral phenomena come about, but I think sort of squishing them all together in this fuzzy category is not a very helpful way of proceeding. If that answers you. So obviously, like I said, I think people invent new ways of doing things. I think that they are shared with others and stabilize or don't. I think some of them solve coordination problems, some of them don't. So I'm interested in all that, but I think once you understand the mechanism, I find talking about norms more trouble than it's worth.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So perhaps just one last question that is more general. What would you say is the relationship between evolutionary psychology and evolutionary anthropology, and in what ways does each of them inform the other?
What's the difference? I don't know. I mean, it's primarily what building they're in. So I don't think they're necessary. I mean, and I'm in a building where people do both, so there isn't much of a difference. I'm not really bothered about what's the difference.
The question was not really about the difference, but about the relationship, because we usually have the two disciplines in separate, right? So perhaps not really in academia, but we still use the name evolutionary psychology and evolutionary anthropology, and because we have the psychological and the anthropological approaches to human behavior, so I don't know, perhaps something along those lines.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, psychology is about me, sociology is about us, and anthropology is about them. So I think it's just a kind of that these are sort of folk distinctions that have got encrusted into local status hierarchies that do slightly different things. In terms of my own interest, I'm interested in what are the mechanisms? How do we explain morality? What are the mechanisms? Where did these mechanisms come from? How do they work? What do they lead us to do? And inevitably, it doesn't make sense to try and do all that within one tribe. So if you are doing work with behavior geneticists, I'm doing work with psychologists and psychometricians coming up with a new moral value scale. The paper I talked about before was with ethnographers and anthropologists looking at cross-cultural differences. And I'm doing some other work with philosophers thinking through the normative implications of a cooperative approach to morality. So, I think the disciplines as we have them are sort of somewhat historical artifacts. In practice, they often specialize in different methods and different techniques. But you should choose whatever technique you need to answer your question, and obviously not be stuck using just one.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so just before we finish our talk, Dr. Curry, would you like perhaps to share with people where they can follow your work online and also where they can find you on social media and things like that? And perhaps, I don't know if you also would like to share with people some interesting piece of work you're doing at the moment.
Oh, well, it's all interesting. Well, so if you go to oliverscottcurry.com. There's a little a page of what I'm on about there, and some links to a few YouTube videos and Google Scholar and all the rest of it. You could also follow me on Twitter on @Oliver_S_Curry, but that's linked from that first page too. So that, yeah, they'd probably be the best places to look. In terms of interesting, well, yeah, like I said, I have a few things in the pipeline. A behavior genetics study coming along at some point. This scale development paper, which is developing an alternative to the Moral Foundations questionnaire along the lines we discussed before. The cross-cultural paper is in press and should be out later this year. So keep an eye on that webpage, and I'll be tweeting it till I'm blue in the face. So you can have a look there too.
Okay, great. So, Dr. Curry, again, I would like to thank you for taking the time to be here with us today. I think it was a very interesting conversation. So, thank you again.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Hi everybody, thank you for coming to my channel and for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel last February and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. To keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge. Any amount, even $1, would already be a great help. Otherwise, if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons, Karen Litzke and Nan Blanchett. Thank you for all.